When I saw my husband pause by the doorway, holding my son's phone in his hands, my breath caught, not from fear of immediate discovery, but because I noticed whose name was glowing on the screen. It wasn't mine. It wasn't anyone in our family. It was his best friend's. The boy who had been in our house more times than I could count, sitting at our table, laughing in our kitchen, helping carry groceries up our steps. My husband's brow furrowed as he scrolled, his thumb moving slowly, like each word he read carried weight. I could see the confusion knitting his forehead, the way his lips tightened, not in anger, but in the sharp edge of realization. I wanted to snatch the phone away, but I stayed frozen, my hand gripping the back of a chair so tightly my knuckles ached. I knew what messages he was seeing. Those clumsy, too honest confessions. Words typed late at night, when boundaries blurred and lines felt easier to cross through a glowing screen. My son's friend had written things he should never have written, and I hadn't stopped him. I didn't write them myself, but I hadn't told him to stop, hadn't shut the door on it when I could have. And now, my husband's thumb kept swiping. Each flick brought him closer to the message that would change everything. The one that couldn't be explained away, that couldn't be laughed off as a joke. I saw the way his jaw tightened as his eyes landed on something. I could hear his breath quicken, shallow and uneven, even from across the room. My own chest felt like it was caving in. A single vibration buzzed through the phone, and a new message appeared. I watched his face go pale as he read the sender's name again. He didn't blink. He didn't speak. The room felt suddenly too small, like the walls had moved closer. I bit the inside of my cheek hard, a habit from years of hiding nerves I could never name aloud. But this time it wasn't just nerves. It was the dread of knowing what I had done. Of knowing that months ago I had let something slip past the safety of friendship, into the dangerous territory of longing. And now, standing in the kitchen with my husband clutching that phone like it held all the answers, I knew, this was the moment I feared more than any other. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake. A mistake that rewrote every line in my life. And now, I don't know how to fix it, but let me tell you how it really happened. Before I share the secret I've been trying to keep buried, leave a comment and tell me, have you ever had a secret you tried desperately to keep, only to watch it unravel anyway? There are moments in life when you realize the silence around you is not just quiet, it's hollow. That's what my mornings had become. A kitchen full of familiar shapes, sunlight falling across the same chipped tile, the same hum of the refrigerator, but none of it felt alive anymore. My husband would pass through, coffee mug in one hand, briefcase in the other, murmuring something about schedules or bills. His words were like the clatter of cutlery, necessary, functional, but empty. He didn't mean to make me feel invisible. That's the worst part, he didn't notice at all. I used to think love was something that grew deeper with age, something that would wrap itself around us like ivy, strong and permanent. But instead, it felt like wallpaper, fading, peeling at the edges, a little more each year. We weren't fighting. There weren't slammed doors or sharp words. Just the slow erosion of attention, the kind that leaves you lonely even when you're not alone. Our son still visited often, though he lived across town now. He'd show up with laundry, or for dinner, sometimes both. And lately, he brought his friend. Always the same one, tall, easygoing, with the kind of laugh that made you notice him even if you didn't want to. He was 19, too young to be significant in any way other than as my son's friend. But from the first time he walked in, I noticed the way he looked at things, our house, the framed pictures on the wall, even me. He didn't look past them. He saw them. The night everything began felt like every other evening at first. I'd been cooking all afternoon, something about having guests, even just my son and his friend, pushed me to do more, to set the table, to find the linen napkins we never used. My husband had called earlier to say he'd be late, voice distracted and rushed, like always. He didn't ask what we were having for dinner. He didn't even ask who would be there. The three of us sat at the table, me, my son, and his friend. The friend helped pass dishes, joked about how he wasn't allowed to leave hungry, and when I laughed, he looked at me longer than necessary, like my laughter meant something more than it did. I told myself I imagined it. I told myself it was just the way teenagers looked at people, open, unfiltered, careless. After they ate, my son went to his old room to grab something, leaving the friend behind with me. He offered to help clear the plates, and I waved him off, but he insisted, rolling up his sleeves and carrying dishes to the sink. The muscles in his forearms flexed as he rinsed plates. I felt ridiculous for noticing. The house was quiet except for the sound of water hitting porcelain. He stood at the sink, sleeves wet to the elbows, hair falling into his eyes as he concentrated on a stubborn bit of sauce on a plate. He was just being polite. That's all it was. But for the first time in years, I felt seen, not as a mother, not as a wife, but as a person standing there. That night, after they left, I stayed in the kitchen long after the dishes were done. The counters were clean, but my thoughts weren't. I kept replaying that look in his eyes when I laughed, the way his hand brushed mine when he took a plate. It was nothing. It should have been nothing. But it didn't feel like nothing. By the next morning, I told myself I had imagined everything. I straightened my hair, tied an apron around my waist, and tried to return to routine. But the truth settled in my chest like a pebble dropped in water. It might look small, but the ripples spread, whether you want them to or not. And deep down, I think I already knew, something had shifted, and pretending otherwise wouldn't make it stop. The next morning began like every other, yet everything felt different beneath the surface. I stood by the kitchen window, pouring coffee into my cup, staring at the steam curling into the air. It should have been a simple ritual, one of those habits so ingrained I no longer thought about it, but now I felt almost detached from my own movements. My husband had already left for work, his brief "don't forget the bills" echoing faintly in the quiet house, as if he were just a voice carried through the hallway rather than a man I had shared decades with. I washed the cup even before finishing the coffee, an excuse to keep my hands busy. But my mind wasn't on the sink or the sponge or the water. It was circling back to the night before, to the subtle shift I'd felt at that dinner table, the unspoken thing that hummed between me and my son's friend like static before a storm. When my phone buzzed on the counter, I nearly dropped the mug I'd just rinsed. It was my son, letting me know he and his friend would be stopping by later to pick something up. My chest tightened with a reaction I couldn't name, something between anticipation and guilt. I spent the rest of the morning pretending to clean. Wiping counters that were already spotless, rearranging fruit in the bowl, folding towels that didn't need folding. It wasn't the chores themselves that mattered, it was the way they distracted my hands, though my mind refused to stay distracted. By the time I heard the familiar sound of the front door creaking open, my heart had started to pound like I was a teenager again, caught doing something I shouldn't. It wasn't my husband. It was them. My son's voice came first, warm and casual, followed by the friend's, lighter, slightly uncertain. They didn't stay long. My son darted into his old room, calling over his shoulder about finding a book he'd left. That left me in the living room with his friend, who hovered in the doorway for a moment before stepping further inside. He smiled, not the wide, careless grin of someone laughing at a joke, but something softer, more hesitant, as if he was trying to decide whether he was welcome. I offered him coffee, mostly to fill the air with something that wasn't silence, and he accepted. His thank you sounded too deliberate, like he was aware of how close he stood as I handed him the cup. We talked about nothing, at least on the surface. He asked how I was, and I answered with the usual small things, errands, the weather, the plants in the yard. But there was something beneath his words, beneath my own. The way he held my gaze a second too long when I mentioned the garden, the way he shifted his weight like he wanted to step closer and didn't. When my son called out that he'd found his book, the friend set down the cup and offered to carry a bag of groceries from the porch inside. It was such a simple gesture, the kind anyone might offer, but my breath caught when our hands brushed as he took the handle from me. It should have meant nothing. A casual touch. But it didn't feel casual. It felt charged, as if the air itself thickened for a moment. The bag was heavier than I expected, and he steadied it, steadying me too, his fingers grazing mine again. This time, neither of us pulled away quickly enough. A pause, just a breath too long, hung there. He looked at me, and in that moment, the world outside seemed to blur. By the time my son reappeared, the bag was on the counter and the friend had stepped back, his expression as neutral as he could make it. We exchanged no words about what had passed between us, not then. The moment slipped quietly under the surface, like a stone sinking into a pond. But that night, when the house went quiet again, I couldn't stop replaying it. The weight of his hand as he steadied the bag, the heat where his fingers had touched mine. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining meaning where there was none. The next day, he returned alone. He had an excuse, he'd forgotten his jacket the night before. It hung on the back of a chair in the living room, but he lingered by the door as if retrieving it wasn't the only reason he'd come. I should have handed him the jacket, thanked him for stopping by, and closed the door. That's what I should have done. Instead, I asked if he wanted tea. He nodded, and I led him to the kitchen, the quiet between us louder than any conversation. He leaned against the counter while I poured the water. The kettle whistled, the mug clinked softly as I set it down. He didn't say much, and neither did I. But there was something in his stillness, in the way his eyes followed my hands, that felt almost like a question neither of us dared to ask. When he stepped closer, it wasn't sudden. It was slow, almost cautious, like he was giving me every chance to step back. I didn't. And then it happened, we kissed. The moment was brief, almost weightless, but it left something behind, something I couldn't shake. When he pulled away, his expression was uncertain, like he'd crossed into unfamiliar territory. I stood frozen, my breath uneven, unable to look at him or away. He left not long after, muttering something about being late. The door closed softly, but the silence that followed was deafening. I stood there for a long time, the taste of guilt and confusion heavy on my tongue. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the dark outline of the dresser, my thoughts looping back to that kiss. It wasn't just the act, it was the fact that I hadn't stopped it. That I hadn't wanted to stop it. I told myself it was nothing. A mistake. A moment of weakness. But as I lay awake, listening to my husband's even breathing beside me, I realized that the real mistake wasn't just the kiss, it was the way part of me wanted it to happen again. The day after the kiss felt strange in ways I couldn't put into words. It wasn't just guilt, it was an unsettling mixture of guilt and anticipation, a nervous electricity humming beneath my skin. I moved through the house in a haze, washing dishes that didn't need washing, straightening picture frames that were already perfectly aligned. I kept thinking, if I stay busy, maybe the thoughts will quiet down. But they didn't. I found myself replaying every second of that moment at the counter. The way he stepped closer, the way his breath had felt against my skin just before it happened, and then the simplicity of it, we kissed. There was nothing elaborate about it, nothing cinematic, yet it lodged itself in my mind like an anchor. Every time I tried to think of something else, my mind would circle back, dragging me to the same question I didn't want to ask myself: why hadn't I stopped it? My husband noticed nothing. He left early again, rushing out the door with the same distracted air he always had on workdays. He kissed my cheek the way someone pats their pocket to make sure they haven't forgotten their keys, not out of affection, but out of routine. I told myself to take comfort in that. If he hadn't noticed anything, maybe I could still convince myself nothing had really happened. But as the hours stretched on, the silence around me turned heavy. Every noise startled me, the mail slot creaking, the hum of the refrigerator, even the distant sound of a car door outside. By late morning, my phone lit up on the counter. A simple message, *K. Are you home? My breath hitched. I stared at the screen, torn between deleting the message and answering it. In the end, my fingers moved before my mind did. Yes. He arrived not long after. I knew it wasn't really about the jacket he'd forgotten yesterday. There were no jackets left behind. No forgotten books or excuses that made sense. When I opened the door, he stood there holding nothing but his hands shoved into his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes a mixture of boldness and hesitation. He stepped inside, and the air between us shifted. We didn't talk about what had happened. Not at first. Instead, we talked about safe things, how the weather had turned colder overnight, how the leaves in the yard had started to fall faster than I could rake them up. But the words felt hollow, like props in a play we both knew wasn't really about them. He glanced around the room, eyes resting on the same things he'd seen a dozen times before, the bookshelf, the family photos, the vase on the side table. But when his gaze landed back on me, it felt sharper, as if he was seeing me differently now, or maybe I was just aware of being seen. I told myself to make it normal. To keep it friendly. To pour tea and talk about anything other than what was pulsing between us. But every movement felt deliberate, reaching for cups, setting the kettle, standing just a little too close when there was plenty of space not to. When my son called, his voice came through the speaker of my phone like a sudden spotlight. He just wanted to let me know he wouldn't be stopping by that evening. It should have been an ordinary update, but it made the house feel even quieter when I hung up. The friends stayed. We didn't touch this time, but we didn't need to. The memory of the kiss hung in the air like perfume, subtle, but impossible to ignore. Every word, every pause between words felt heavier. When he left, I watched him walk down the driveway, hands still shoved in his pockets, head down slightly like he was thinking about something he couldn't say. I closed the door slowly, the echo of the latch sounding louder than usual. That night, I lay awake in bed, listening to the even rhythm of my husband's breathing beside me. He had no idea what was happening in my head. No idea what had already happened in our kitchen. He had spent dinner talking about a broken copier at work and some project he had to finish by Friday. He never asked why I was quiet, never looked closely enough to see the cracks in my composure. Part of me wanted to shake him, to shout, "See me." Another part of me feared what would happen if he ever really did. The next morning, I tried to tell myself I wouldn't see the friend again. That it had been a moment, one I could quietly erase if I just didn't let it happen again. But then I thought about how he'd looked when he stood in my doorway, how his presence seemed to change the temperature of the room, and I knew erasing it wouldn't be so simple. I distracted myself by running errands I didn't need to run, buying bread when there was already bread, driving across town for nothing in particular. Yet even in the grocery store, picking up oranges, I caught myself imagining the sound of his voice, the look in his eyes. By the time I returned home, the sun had already begun to set, throwing long shadows across the living room floor. I locked the door and stood there in the quiet, telling myself I had to make a choice, draw a line, or pretend there wasn't one at all. But the truth was, the line had already been crossed. And the longer I stood there, the more I realized I wasn't sure I wanted to step back. The days that followed stretched out strangely, each one carrying a weight that pressed on my chest. Everything looked the same chipped edge of the kitchen counter, the same hum from the hallway heater, but I couldn't shake the sense that something beneath the surface had shifted forever. I tried to live inside my routines like they were armor, but nothing protected me from my own thoughts. I found myself lingering on the smallest things. The faint imprint his cup had left on the kitchen table the last time he was here. The way the back door creaked when someone pushed it open, the sound I now associated with him, not with my son. Every tiny detail turned into a reminder I hadn't asked for. I kept telling myself I would pull away, that I would set boundaries. That there was still time to turn this into nothing more than a passing mistake. But then came the message. It was in the afternoon, while I was folding laundry. The phone buzzed, and when I saw his name on the screen, my breath stuttered. He asked something harmless, almost absurdly so. Do you know if your son still has my notebook? The words were practical, but the act of reaching out wasn't. It wasn't the notebook he was thinking about, and I knew it. I stared at that message far too long, weighing every possible response. I typed "I'll ask him," then erased it. Typed "not sure," erased it again. Finally, I sent a simple "I think so." It should have ended there. But it didn't. One message turned into another, and soon we weren't talking about the notebook at all. We talked about things that had nothing to do with him being my son's friend. How the mornings felt colder lately, how the trees behind the house had lost almost all their leaves. It was ordinary, but it wasn't. There was a kind of intimacy in how easy it was to talk about nothing. That evening, I decided to get out of the house, as if a different location could quiet the noise in my head. I told my husband I needed to pick up a few things at the market, though the pantry was already full. He barely looked up from his papers, just murmured, "Okay," like my leaving or staying made no difference at all. Driving through the dim streets felt like exhaling for the first time in days. I stopped at a small cafe I hadn't visited in years, a quiet place with warm light spilling through the windows. I walked in just looking for distraction, for an hour spent in someone else's atmosphere. And then I saw him. He was sitting alone at a table near the window, a book open in front of him, though he wasn't reading it. His eyes lifted and met mine, and in that instant the cafe's warmth turned heavy. It could have been coincidence. It probably was. But it didn't feel that way. I almost left. I almost turned around and walked out, but my feet moved toward his table before my mind caught up. He smiled, not a wide grin, but something quieter, more careful. He gestured to the chair across from him, and I sat down, pretending I hadn't already crossed another invisible line just by doing so. We ordered coffee, and the conversation started safely enough. We talked about how small the town felt sometimes, about the books he was reading for class, about the weather turning again. But with each passing minute, the conversation bent. It curved away from casual. There was a moment when he looked straight at me and said, quietly, "You always seem so calm." The words shouldn't have landed the way they did. They shouldn't have made my chest tighten or my throat go dry. But they did. I tried to deflect with a small laugh, but he didn't laugh back. He just held my gaze, and for a second the world outside that window felt like it had gone still. I don't remember how long we sat there, but when I finally stood up to leave, I felt a strange weight settle over me, not regret, not exactly, but an awareness that I was further in than I had admitted even to myself. Driving home, the road felt longer than usual. The traffic lights, the familiar houses, the grocery store on the corner, they all blurred past, but my mind stayed stuck in that cafe. I couldn't stop thinking about how he had looked at me when he said those words, like he saw something even I had forgotten was there. At home, the house smelled faintly of dinner. My husband had reheated leftovers. He asked me, distractedly, if I'd found everything I needed at the store. I nodded, lying easily. The lie didn't feel like a single action, it felt like a slope, one I was already sliding down. Later, in bed, I stared at the ceiling. My husband fell asleep beside me, his breathing deep and even, and I felt that same ache I'd been feeling for months. The ache of being next to someone who didn't see me, while someone else, someone I shouldn't think about, did. I told myself it was just coffee. Just a coincidence. Just a conversation. But deep down, I knew that every just I whispered to myself was another crack in the life I thought I had under control. The next few days blurred together in a strange rhythm of pretending and feeling too much. I went through the motions of life like someone trying on clothes that didn't quite fit, smiling at neighbors, asking my husband if he wanted more coffee, folding laundry that smelled faintly of detergent and emptiness. On the outside, nothing looked different. But inside, I couldn't stop thinking about how close we had been in that cafe, and what it meant that I hadn't walked away. I told myself the same lie over and over, that the line could still be drawn, that I could still step back. But the truth was, I had already been stepping closer, one quiet decision at a time. It was my husband's trip that pushed everything further. He had mentioned it casually a week earlier, an overnight conference 2 towns over. He left on a Thursday morning, his suitcase bumping against the doorway as he rolled it out, his goodbye kiss landing somewhere between habit and absence. He didn't linger. He never lingered. The silence after the door closed was different this time. It wasn't just quiet, it was hollow. The house felt bigger, the rooms emptier. I moved through them as if they were unfamiliar, even though I'd walked those hallways for years. I should have filled the time with chores, with errands, with anything that kept my mind from wandering. Instead, I wandered straight into trouble. That afternoon, there was a knock on the door. Not loud, but steady. When I opened it, he stood there. No excuse this time, not a forgotten book, not a misplaced jacket. He didn't hold anything, and he didn't try to pretend he had. For a moment, we just stood there, the doorway holding more weight than it should have. I should have said something to send him away, something polite and firm. But I didn't. I stepped aside. He walked in. The house felt different with him inside it. The air felt thicker somehow, as though the walls themselves understood what neither of us was saying out loud. We sat at the kitchen table first, because that's where I always tried to put a layer of normalcy over everything. I poured tea, asked if he wanted sugar, filled the silence with small talk that didn't mean anything. But every movement felt sharper. When his hand brushed mine reaching for the spoon, I felt it all the way up my arm. The conversation shifted like it always seemed to lately, starting with safe things and veering towards something that wasn't safe at all. He asked about my day. I asked about his classes. But then he told me he didn't sleep much the night before, and when I asked why, he paused before answering. I couldn't stop thinking. I didn't ask what about. I didn't need to. There was a stillness after that. Not the kind of stillness that feels empty, the kind that feels like the room is holding its breath. I don't remember who moved first. Maybe it was both of us at once, as if the space between us had finally collapsed. But then, suddenly, we kissed. This time, it wasn't tentative the way it had been before. It wasn't an accident we could pretend hadn't happened. It was a choice. When it ended, neither of us spoke. He stayed close, his eyes searching mine like there was an answer there he didn't know how to find. I couldn't look away. He left not long after, his jacket still hanging from his arm, his steps uneven on the front porch as if he wasn't sure where to put his feet. I stayed in the kitchen, my hands pressed against the table like it could hold me steady. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second making the silence heavier. Later that evening, as the light faded and the house grew darker, I felt the ache of what had just happened settling deep inside me. Not just guilt, though there was guilt, sharp and undeniable, but something harder to name. A realization. I couldn't pretend anymore that this was just a moment, or just a mistake. When I went to bed that night, the sheets felt too cold, the room too wide. My husband wasn't there, and I felt both relief and shame at how much easier it was not having him beside me. I stared at the ceiling for hours, knowing that nothing I told myself would undo what I had allowed to happen. Because there was no going back, not from this. The morning after that second kiss, the house felt like it was holding a secret inside its walls, and I was terrified that anyone who walked through the door would hear it in the creak of the floorboards. I moved carefully, as if being too loud might somehow draw attention to the thoughts I was trying to push down. My husband came home from his trip in the early afternoon. His suitcase bumped up the stairs, and his voice carried through the hallway in that distracted, almost impersonal way it always did after time away. He asked how things were, and I said, fine. The word felt heavy, like it was hiding too much. He didn't notice anything wrong. Or maybe he did and didn't care enough to ask. He talked about the conference, about how long the drive was, about a restaurant he'd tried with colleagues. He sat at the table, scrolling through emails, while I stood by the counter pretending to be busy. I thought the return of normalcy would feel like safety. Instead, it felt like suffocation. Every ordinary moment, him asking about dinner, him setting down his phone, him folding the newspaper, made me more aware of what I'd done. In the middle of all this, our son came over. He was cheerful, carrying a box of things he'd picked up from his apartment. He plopped it down on the floor and rummaged through it while talking about his week. And then, without warning, he said it. He's always saying how amazing you are, he said casually, grinning as he dug out an old hoodie. Like, he can't stop talking about it. The room tilted for a second. My hands froze on the dish I was drying. My heart slammed so hard I thought my husband would hear it. My son didn't mean anything by it, his tone was light, teasing even. But the words landed like a hammer. I glanced at my husband. He chuckled, shaking his head, but something in his eyes sharpened, just for a second. It was small, so small that maybe I imagined it, but I felt it. A shift, a question, a tiny fracture. I forced a laugh, the kind that felt brittle, and changed the subject too quickly. My son didn't notice. My husband didn't say anything. But the air in the room was heavier after that, as if we were all breathing in something unsaid. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark listening to my husband's steady breathing beside me, feeling like the silence was screaming. The next day, I found myself checking my phone constantly, as if expecting another message, another reason to think about him. It didn't come. The quiet should have been a relief. It wasn't. By evening, my nerves were raw. Every sound startled me, the mail slot creaking, the dog barking 2 houses away. I jumped when the phone finally buzzed. It was him. The message was simple, almost absurdly so, "Are you okay?" 2 words. That was all. But they felt like a lifeline and a trap at the same time. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering, before typing back "I think so." We didn't talk about what had happened. Not directly. But the space between the words said everything. The way he wrote, the pauses before I answered, the silence after, it all felt like we were balancing on a thin edge neither of us wanted to name. When I set my phone down, my hands were trembling. Later, I stood at the kitchen sink staring out the window into the dark. The reflection of the room glimmered on the glass, and for a moment, I didn't recognize the woman standing there. Because she was holding on to something she shouldn't. And she wasn't ready to let go. The evening it happened began like so many others, quiet, almost painfully ordinary. My husband had gone to meet a client, saying he might not be back until late. His voice was matter-of-fact when he said it, as if his absence was nothing more than a calendar entry. The moment the door clicked behind him, the house changed. It wasn't louder or quieter, it simply felt different, as if the walls noticed when he was gone. I told myself I would spend the night doing something safe, something unremarkable, sorting through drawers, maybe starting the book that had been sitting on my nightstand for weeks. I didn't plan for the knock at the door. It wasn't forceful. Just a steady, polite knock that sent my stomach into a freefall. When I opened the door, he stood there, hands shoved into his pockets, head tilted just slightly like he was bracing himself for me to tell him to leave. "I forgot something," he said softly, though there was no jacket, no book, no reason visible in his hands. I should have asked him to come back another day. I should have said it wasn't a good time. But I didn't. I stepped aside. He came in. The house felt different with him inside it, like even the air shifted to make space for something unspoken. We stood in the entryway for a moment, neither of us knowing what to do with our hands, our voices, our eyes. We ended up in the kitchen because that's where we always seemed to end up. It was safer there, I thought, bright lights, familiar chairs, the ordinary comfort of mugs on the counter. But even there, the safety felt like an illusion. We talked about nothing, the way you talk about nothing when everything underneath is too big to touch. I asked if he'd eaten dinner. He said yes, but the answer was absent, like he wasn't thinking about food at all. There was a pause then, a long one. He stood by the table, fingers grazing the back of a chair. I leaned against the counter, my hand flat on the surface as if the coolness might steady me. And then it happened, the thing I'd both feared and felt coming. We spent the night together. It wasn't planned. It wasn't spoken about. There was no lead-in, no clear start, no one moment where I could say, this is where the line was crossed. It was a slow, steady collapse of the walls we'd been pretending were still standing. When it was over, the silence was enormous. He sat at the edge of the bed, his head in his hands for a moment, before looking up at me with a kind of uncertain softness. I couldn't meet his gaze for long. It felt too much like looking into a mirror I wasn't ready for. Neither of us knew what to say. Words would have made it too real, and yet saying nothing made it unbearable. He stood eventually, gathering his things that weren't really scattered, pausing at the door as if waiting for me to tell him something he didn't even know how to ask. I didn't. The door closed behind him quietly, almost apologetically. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty space where he had been. The room looked the same as it had that morning, the same lamp, the same books stacked by the wall, but it wasn't the same. I wasn't the same. When I finally went to wash my face, the mirror felt unkind. I avoided my own eyes, staring instead at the tiles behind me, at the small chip in the corner of the sink, at anything that wasn't my reflection. Later, I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the distant sound of a car passing on the street, the faint creak of the house settling. I thought about what had just happened, about the weight of it pressing into my chest. Because I knew there was no way to undo it. No way to turn back the clock or pretend this hadn't changed everything. And for the first time, I let myself wonder, not just what I had done, but what would come next. The morning after felt like walking into a version of my own house that wasn't entirely mine anymore. The sunlight came through the curtains the same way it always did, dust motes floating in the air like nothing had changed, but I couldn't shake the weight of what I'd done. It followed me into every room, heavy as the shadows that stretched across the walls. I woke before my husband came home. I sat in the kitchen for a long time, hands wrapped around a mug I never drank from, staring at the faint smudge on the table where his notebook had once rested, at the grooves in the wood from years of use. The house was silent, but my thoughts weren't. When I heard my husband's key turn in the lock later that afternoon, my body stiffened as if the sound itself was an accusation. The door swung open, and he stepped inside, setting his suitcase down with the usual thud, calling out, "I'm home," in that offhand way he always did. I smiled the way I always did too. A smile so practiced it almost fooled me. He kissed my cheek. It was quick, perfunctory, the kind of kiss two people exchange without really looking at each other. And for the first time, I felt a sharp sting from it, like being reminded of something I'd been avoiding, the absence of weight in that gesture, the absence of meaning. We talked in fragments. Him about the trip, about a late dinner with colleagues, about traffic. Me about groceries, about the neighbor's new fence, about the weather. Nothing either of us said mattered, and yet every word felt like a test. I was terrified he could see it on me. That he would look at me too long and notice something had shifted in my face, my voice, my very presence. But he didn't. Or maybe he did, and just didn't ask. That was worse somehow. Later, he settled into the armchair with his laptop, muttering about emails. I watched him from the doorway, the glow of the screen reflecting off his glasses. He looked tired. Not suspicious, not angry, just tired. I found myself wondering what would happen if he knew. If he understood what had happened here while he was gone. The thought was a sudden jolt, like cold water, and I had to sit down before my knees gave way. The guilt came in waves, but it wasn't alone. Alongside it was something harder to name, a tension, a restlessness that wouldn't leave me. When the house went quiet that night, my phone buzzed on the counter. Just one word, hey. I stared at it for a long time, feeling every beat of my pulse in my fingers. I typed a reply and erased it. Typed again. Erased again. Finally, I sent back the simplest thing I could, hi. The exchange that followed wasn't long. It didn't have to be. A few words, a few pauses, and the silence between them carried the weight of everything we weren't saying. When I set the phone down, my hands shook. I went to the window and looked out at the street. The lamps were casting long pools of light across the pavement, and in the distance, a dog barked once, then stopped. It was such an ordinary scene, but it felt like something was pressing against the edges of it, like even the night knew there was a secret in this house now. When I finally went to bed, my husband was already asleep, breathing evenly, one arm thrown across the blanket. I lay beside him, staring into the dark, thinking about the way the air had felt when that door closed behind the friend the night before. I thought about the look on his face when he left. And I realized that even though the room was quiet, my life had turned into a noise I couldn't turn off. The days after felt like moving through fog, everything around me was familiar, but distant, muffled, as if a layer of glass separated me from my own life. I still cooked dinner, still answered the door, still folded laundry and stacked dishes in the cupboards. But it was all mechanical. My hands moved, my body did things, and my mind stayed somewhere else entirely. Our son came by one evening, dropping his bag in the hallway with the easy familiarity of someone who still saw the house as partly his. He rummaged in the fridge, asked what was for dinner, started talking about a class he was taking, normal things, easy things. I smiled and nodded, clinging to those ordinary words like they were a raft. Then he said it. Almost laughing, he tossed the words over his shoulder like they were nothing. You know, he's always saying how amazing you are. My breath caught. The spoon I was holding slipped against the counter, clattering louder than it should have. I could feel the warmth drain from my face, the sudden rush of heat flooding back all at once, the way my heart thudded too hard against my ribs. He didn't notice. He was still talking, his voice light and careless. I mean, he won't shut up about it. Like, he thinks you're the greatest person ever. I dared a glance at my husband, who was sitting at the table flipping through the mail. He laughed, a short, almost dismissive sound, but for the briefest second, his eyes narrowed just a fraction, just enough that it made the air in the room feel heavier. I forced out a laugh. It felt brittle, like thin glass that could shatter if anyone looked too closely. I made some joke, I don't even remember what, trying to push the conversation forward, away from the weight of those words. Our son didn't notice the shift. He just kept talking, pulling another soda from the fridge, launching into a story about a classmate. But I could feel the unease settle into my husband's silence. Later that night, when the house was quiet again, I sat alone in the kitchen with the lights dimmed. The mail was still on the table, my son's empty soda can by the sink, and the words from earlier kept circling in my mind like an echo I couldn't silence. He's always saying how amazing you are. I wondered if my husband would think about it again. I wondered if he'd let the thought go, or if it would burrow into some corner of his mind, waiting. The next day, nothing looked different, but I felt it, the edge, the thinness of the ice I was standing on. Every word my husband spoke felt like it could turn into a question if I breathed wrong. And yet, when my phone buzzed that afternoon, my pulse jumped anyway. It was him. The message was short. Just checking in. I should have ignored it. I knew that. But my thumb moved without asking permission, tapping out a reply so quickly it startled me. I'm fine. Just a busy day, He wrote back almost instantly. I just keep thinking about the other night. I stared at the screen, that one line blazing back at me, and my breath hitched. I didn't reply right away. I set the phone down, walked into another room, then came back, picking it up again like it might say something different if I looked twice. I typed, erased, typed again. Finally, I sent the smallest possible response, me too. The silence after that reply felt louder than any ringtone. That evening, I set the table, made dinner, answered my husband's questions about the neighbor's new fence and his coworkers' retirement plans. On the outside, I was still playing the part. But every time my phone buzzed in the other room, my body tensed, even when it was just a news alert or a grocery store coupon. I could feel the pressure building, not just from guilt, but from something else entirely. The sense that what we had done wasn't something I could fold away neatly like an old receipt. Because now the secret wasn't just between me and him. The words my son had said hung in the air like an open door. And I couldn't stop wondering who might walk through it. The days after my son's offhand remark felt like waiting for something I couldn't name, something I couldn't stop even if I wanted to. The words he had said, he's always saying how amazing you are, kept looping in my head like a song I didn't want to hear. They weren't meant as an accusation, they weren't even meant to matter, but they had cracked something. My husband didn't bring it up. Not directly. But the silence between us shifted. It started small. The way he'd look at me just a fraction longer before speaking. The way his hand would pause for an extra second as he flipped through the mail, like he was distracted by a thought he wouldn't say aloud. He didn't accuse me of anything. He didn't even ask questions. But that silence, the one filled with almost questions, was harder to bear than any confrontation would have been. I started noticing every detail of his face as if I were trying to read it for answers. The faint lines by his eyes, the way his jaw would clench just slightly when he concentrated. I kept wondering, did he suspect? Or was he just tired, like he always was, and I was projecting my guilt onto him? The house didn't feel like a refuge anymore. Every corner felt like it could hold a shadow of what I'd done. The kitchen, the hallway, the bedroom, all of them carried the memory of choices I couldn't take back. I tried to fill my days with tasks. I scrubbed the stove until the metal gleamed. I reorganized closets no one would ever open. But no matter how many things I cleaned, the heaviness didn't leave. And then, one afternoon, I sent him a message, the kind of message that looked harmless if anyone saw it. We need to talk. He came by that evening. I could tell he was nervous when he walked in, the way he glanced toward the hallway like he was checking if anyone else was home. We sat in the living room, and for a long time, neither of us said anything. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, the sound of every second stretching out the silence. Finally, I spoke. My voice didn't feel like my own. We can't keep whatever this is. The words felt heavy in my mouth, like stones I'd been holding there for too long. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He just nodded once, his face unreadable, like he had been expecting this conversation. But his eyes stayed on me, and I couldn't hold his gaze for long. We didn't touch that night. Not even a brush of fingers. When he left, he didn't linger in the doorway. He didn't look back. He just stepped out into the dark, and the door closed behind him with a final, soft click that echoed through the house louder than I expected. After he left, I sat on the edge of the couch for a long time, staring at the spot where he'd been sitting. The cushion still had the faintest dent from where he had leaned, and I traced it with my hand like that shape might give me answers. Later, when my husband came home, the house felt even smaller. He set his keys on the table, the same way he always did. He asked about dinner, the same way he always did. But I felt it, the weight between us. The things unsaid, the questions hanging in the air, the choices I couldn't undo. That night, lying awake while he slept beside me, I stared into the dark and listened to the sound of his breathing. I wondered if there would be a day when everything I'd been holding back would come spilling out. I wondered if he already knew, deep down, and was just waiting for me to say it. And I wondered how long I could keep living in this space between secrets and silence, knowing that sooner or later, something would break.